Let me explain something that most history books never bother to ask. The world knows how Adolf Hitler died. A pistol shot in a dark bunker under the ruins of Berlin, April 1945. That image is burned into our collective memory. But what about the ones who shared his blood? What happened to the people who carried his name? His siblings, his nephew, the silent relatives who had to walk out of that war with the weight of a cursed surname? What became of the family of the man who embodied terror itself? Picture Berlin in those final days. The streets are nothing but rubble. Civilians dig through ruins, scavenging for bread, while Soviet shells thunder over the city. Somewhere below ground, the most wanted man in history takes his last breath. And yet, outside the bunker, scattered across Europe and even across the ocean, his family is still alive. That's the part I want to walk you through. Because their stories are not of power or glory. They are stories of obscurity, of shame, and of a lifelong effort to bury the past that clung to their blood. To me, that's almost more haunting than the dictator himself. On April 30th, 1945, in a bunker deep beneath the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler ended his life with a single gunshot. The Red Army was already closing in. The Reich was nothing but rubble, and the dream of his 1,000-year empire had collapsed in less than 12 years. That's the image we all know. The dictator trapped and cornered, choosing death over surrender. But here's where it gets more unsettling. Outside of that bunker, scattered across Germany and even abroad, his family was still alive. They woke up the next morning in a world that hated everything connected to his name. And they realized that while Hitler was gone, they had to keep living, with the burden of being related to him. Now, let me explain why this moment is so important. For the rest of the world, Hitler's death felt like closure. The war was finally ending. But for his relatives, it was only the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. They didn't inherit power or wealth. What they inherited was a surname so poisoned, so heavy, it turned every interaction into suspicion. I try to imagine that feeling. Introducing yourself, giving your name, and immediately seeing people's faces change. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. That single word, Hitler, was enough to ruin any chance at a normal life. Germany itself was crumbling in those days. Cities flattened, millions homeless, survivors searching for food. And in the middle of that chaos, the relatives of Hitler had no way to disappear completely. Neighbors knew who they were. Authorities had files on them. Journalists wanted to ask questions. So what do you do if your brother, your uncle, your nephew was Adolf Hitler? Do you hide? Do you change your name? Do you pretend you never knew him? There wasn't an easy answer. Only fear and shame. After 1945, the name Hitler didn't belong to one man anymore. It became a mark of infamy, stamped onto anyone unfortunate enough to share it. And those people had to decide, embrace it, deny it, or bury it forever. Imagine the weight of signing papers, of handing over your passport, of telling someone at a checkpoint who you were, the fear of being recognized, the shame of being linked to crimes you never committed, but that the world would always associate with you. What chills me most is how invisible their suffering was. The history books don't follow them. The headlines weren't about them. And yet, they were living in the ruins too, paying a price in silence. It's a different kind of punishment, not in courtrooms, not in prisons, but in the everyday act of carrying a cursed name. So when I think of Hitler's death, I don't just see that bunker. I see the scattered faces of his family, stepping out into a world where their very identity had become a scar. And to me, that's where the story really begins. Now let me tell you what happened to Hitler's closest family after the fall of the Third Reich. Let's start with Alois Hitler Jr., Adolf's half-brother. Alois had always been a restless man, drifting from city to city, never staying long in one place. Before the war, he had spent time abroad, even living in Ireland and England. He ran businesses, tried his hand at restaurants, and attempted to build a life independent of his infamous family. Yet the name Hitler followed him everywhere. Even abroad, people whispered, recognized him, or asked questions he didn't want to answer. Alois was ambitious, yes, but not ruthless like his brother. He wanted a comfortable life, yet his surname made that impossible. After 1945, he returned to Germany, to Hamburg, a city in ruins and full of suspicion. He tried to live quietly, blending into the crowd. I can't help but picture him walking down the streets. Every glance from neighbors, a tiny accusation. Every introduction a test. Do they see the man or the shadow of his brother? The weight of that name must have been suffocating. Alois couldn't erase it, and yet he tried with everything he had. Now, Angela Hitler, Adolf's half-sister, had a very different path. She had been close to her brother at various points, even managing household affairs at the Berghof. Her daughter, Jelly Robel, lived with Hitler in Munich during the late 1920s. Jelly's mysterious death in 1931 cast a shadow over the family, and Angela carried that too. During the Nazi years, Angela was known but not prominent. She moved quietly, supporting her family while avoiding politics herself. After 1945, she vanished from public view almost entirely. She lived quietly in Germany, avoiding interviews, avoiding attention. Imagine what that must have felt like, hiding in a small apartment, shopping for food like everyone else. Yet knowing that if someone learned her last name, whispers would follow. The world had no interest in her survival, but carrying that name made survival itself an ordeal. Alois and Angela were not politicians, generals, or war criminals. They were relatives left to navigate the wreckage of a country that despised them for something beyond their control. They had to reconstruct their lives among ruins, not just of buildings, but of reputation. Every day was a negotiation between normalcy and the burden of history. I keep imagining Alois trying to run a business, serving customers who might have fought in the war. Did they see him as just another German citizen? Or did they see the shadow of his brother, the man who orchestrated so much death? Angela, too, must have felt a constant tension. Every visitor, every neighbor, every casual introduction carried the possibility of recognition, and with it, judgment. This is the strange punishment of family ties. Not courts, not execution, but a lifelong sentence of fear and invisibility. Some relatives changed their names. Some moved to distant towns. Some swore never to have children, hoping the bloodline would end quietly. The silence around them was deafening. History remembers the dictator, not the family who had to carry the name. Yet it is in that silence that their story lives. Alois and Angela survived, yes, but at the cost of freedom. Every day was a careful balance between being seen and being invisible, between existing and being erased. And I have to admit, when I think about it, it gives me chills. Not for what they did, but for what they had to endure simply for who they were. Living with a name that carried terror is no small burden. It shapes every thought, every action, every plan for the future. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, yet ordinary was never enough to protect them. Alois died quietly in 1956. Angela passed in 1949, her life almost erased from public memory. The irony is bitter. The man who sought to dominate history left his family to hide from it. I can picture them now, ghosts in the ruins of Germany, stepping carefully through streets that remembered too much. Every interaction, every word spoken, a negotiation with the past. And that, I think, is the real story of Hitler's closest relatives. Not of power, not of infamy, but of survival under the heaviest shadow imaginable. They remind us that history doesn't end with death. Sometimes it lingers in names, in bloodlines, in lives that are forced to vanish quietly. Now let me explain the strange and remarkable story of William Patrick Hitler, Adolf's nephew, a man whose life was forever intertwined with one of history's darkest figures, and yet who chose a path completely his own. William was born in 1911 in Liverpool, England, the son of Alois Hitler Jr. and Bridget Dowling. From the start, he lived with the shadow of a name that would one day terrify the world. He spent his youth in relative normalcy, but the rising tide of his uncle's ambitions changed everything. By the 1930s, Adolf Hitler's rise in Germany was impossible to ignore, even from across the sea. In 1933, William made the fateful decision to move to Germany. He hoped to find work and maybe even benefit from the family connection. It's hard not to imagine the mix of curiosity and dread he must have felt stepping into a country dominated by his uncle's vision. But William quickly discovered that being Hitler's nephew was more complicated than he had imagined. Some doors opened for him, yes, jobs, introductions, a certain degree of attention. Yet suspicion followed him too, whispers questioning his motives, his loyalty, his intentions. He soon realized that the name Hitler was both a key and a cage. By 1939, with the world teetering on the brink of war, William left Germany. He moved to England first, attempting to escape the shadow of his uncle, seeking freedom from the constant scrutiny and expectation. But fate had more in store for him than quiet exile. When the United States entered World War II, William made a choice that few could imagine. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy, choosing to fight against the very country his uncle had ruled. I find that decision astonishing, to take up arms not just for your country, but against your own blood. It's the ultimate act of defiance and self-definition. Imagine the courage it took to step into that role. Every uniform, every ship, every mission was a statement. I am not my uncle. I am my own man. William served honorably in the Navy, participating in missions in the Atlantic. He contributed to the war effort, proving in a very public way that family ties did not dictate loyalty or morality. For him, the war was not just global conflict. It was personal. After the war, William faced yet another challenge. The name Hitler remained a weight, a stigma that could not be ignored. He chose to change it legally, adopting the name Stuart Houston. Under this new identity, he built a quiet life in New York. He married, had children, and raised a family far from the public eye. No headlines, no notoriety, just the slow reconstruction of a life that had begun under a shadow. The family kept a low profile, avoiding interviews, avoiding public curiosity. I often think about what that must mean, to grow up with a family story that is both a link to history and a burden never spoken of aloud. The name is gone, but the memory lingers like a shadow that cannot be named. Unlike others in his family, he chose defiance, service, and anonymity. He could have stayed in Germany, pursued power, or tried to exploit his uncle's rise. Instead, he turned away, fought for the Allies, and rebuilt his life from scratch. I keep picturing him as a young man in a Navy uniform, staring across the Atlantic, thinking of Germany, thinking of his uncle. Every action he took was a reclamation of his identity, a refusal to be defined by the most notorious figure in history. And what stays with me is this: the past can be heavy, even crushing. But William's life shows that even the darkest inheritance can be transformed. Through courage, decision, and determination, he carved a path that was entirely his own. His story is quieter than history books suggest, yet more profound. It's not about victories on the battlefield or global fame. It's about surviving the shadow of a name, reclaiming agency, and quietly building a legacy that contrasts sharply with the one his uncle left behind. I like to imagine him in his later years, looking at his children, knowing that the shadow of Adolf Hitler no longer touches their lives. That perhaps, finally, the family name he inherited carries only the meaning he chooses to give it. And so, William Patrick Hitler, Stuart Houston, stands as a testament to resilience. A reminder that even in the most impossible circumstances, one can choose a different path. A path that leads not into notoriety, but into quiet dignity. Now let me tell you about Paula Hitler, the youngest sister of Adolf, and the life she led after 1945. Her story is quiet, almost invisible, but it carries the weight of surviving under a name that the world could never forgive. Paula was born in 1896, the last child of the Hitler family. By the time the war ended, she was in her late 40s, living in a Germany that was unrecognizable. The world had been destroyed, cities flattened, and society scrambling to pick up the pieces. Paula herself had little means, no wealth, no power, just her own presence in a devastated land. She chose to remain in Berchtesgaden, the small alpine town near Hitler's mountain retreat. It was modest, secluded, a life far from the limelight her brother had occupied. I imagine her walking through the narrow streets, neighbors whispering, journalists occasionally appearing, hoping for a story. Every day, she had to balance curiosity with discretion, interest with caution. Despite offers, interviews, and temptations to profit from her last name, Paula refused. She would not exploit the legacy of her brother. Even when pressed, she remained silent, almost stubbornly so. Her life was simple. She lived modestly, relied on small pensions, and rarely spoke about the past. What fascinates me is her contradictions. Occasionally, she would give small interviews, offering a glimpse of her thoughts, yet they were vague, careful, almost rehearsed. Sometimes she appeared distant, other times defensive, as though the weight of history pressed on her chest. She witnessed the world's fascination with her family, yet she rejected it entirely. She refused to be a spectacle, a reminder of terror, or a tool for curiosity. I keep picturing her in her small apartment, looking out at the mountains, thinking of a world she never shaped, but that forever defined her. The questions never stopped, but the answers were often nowhere to be found. Paula's life was marked by silence, but that silence spoke volumes. It was a refusal, a shield, a quiet way of asserting control over a story that had consumed the lives of everyone around her. She died in 1960, largely unnoticed, having kept her distance from the media and public. Her modest life in Berchtesgaden remained a contrast to the notoriety attached to her name. What strikes me most is this: the last living sibling of Hitler, living quietly in a world that could never forget, chose invisibility over fame, modesty over exploitation. And in that choice, there's a strange dignity, a resistance of its own kind. Even in the shadow of one of history's darkest figures, Paula carved out her own path, not through heroism or power, but through silence, discretion, and the courage to live a life on her own terms. Her story reminds us that history is not only shaped by the famous or the infamous. Sometimes it is quietly carried in the footsteps of those who survive, unnoticed, choosing to walk their own path despite the weight of a name. I like to imagine her final days, sitting by a window, mountains before her, a small life carefully preserved, the world's curiosity at bay, the last connection to a family that the world wanted to see as monstrous. Yet she lived with it quietly, almost defiantly, on her own terms. Now let me tell you about the descendants of William Patrick Hitler, the last branch of Adolf's bloodline, and the quiet lives they have chosen. Their story is one of restraint, anonymity, and the heavy weight of a name they never claimed. William's children grew up in the United States, far from Europe and the ruins of their family's past. They inherited nothing of their uncle's infamy except the caution it demanded. From an early age, they understood the burden that came with their lineage. The world might one day ask questions, and they resolved never to provide answers. One of the most striking decisions they made was to have no children. A deliberate choice to let the family line end quietly, away from history's eyes. Imagine living with that knowledge. Your very existence is tied to a shadow you can never fully escape. Every interaction, every introduction, carries an invisible tension, a silent warning. They built their lives carefully, choosing professions, homes, and relationships that would never attract attention. The media's curiosity was a danger they could not risk. I picture them moving through American suburbs, blending in perfectly, ordinary yet forever marked by blood. No parties, no interviews, no public life, only privacy, carefully guarded. The isolation was profound, but it was chosen. It was a form of protection, a barrier against the curiosity that could undo them. Even in family gatherings, I imagine the unspoken weight of history pressing quietly. Every conversation might hint at their lineage, yet the truth remains unspoken. Living as a Hitler descendant in America is a life defined by restraint. It is a life of shadows, of careful avoidance, of self-imposed exile within one's own home. They carry a solitude that is both protective and suffocating. A quiet vigilance shapes every choice, every movement, every thought. Yet, in that silence, there is also resilience. They survived the legacy of a name without letting it dictate their actions or identity. I keep imagining them in small, private moments, looking out at the world, invisible to most, yet forever aware. Their existence is a testament to the cost of history, and to the strength it takes to live quietly under its shadow. This is the story of the silent heirs, living far from the spotlight, choosing anonymity over fame, discretion over notoriety. A family line that ends not with scandal, but with dignity, quietly, and deliberately. Their lives remind us that the impact of a name can be lifelong, and that sometimes the bravest choice is to remain unseen, preserving oneself and the future from the weight of the past. Now let me explain what it truly meant to carry the name Hitler after 1945, and the invisible burden that weighed on those who bore it. This is not a story of power or politics, but of memory, shame, and the delicate line between blood and choice. Imagine walking down a street in post-war Germany, every neighbor's glance filled with suspicion. Every greeting carries an unspoken question. Are you like him? For those who survived under the shadow of the name, normal life became almost impossible. Jobs, friendships, even casual interactions were colored by fear, curiosity, and judgment. The weight of history was tangible, pressing on every decision, every word spoken, every step taken. To carry that name was to carry the memory of atrocity, whether deserved or not. I picture young William Patrick Hitler moving to the United States, trying to escape the past. Even there, in a country across the ocean, the shadow followed, a reminder of the lineage he could never fully abandon. The same applied to Paula in Berchtesgaden, Alois in Hamburg, and Angela quietly disappearing from view. Every family member had to negotiate the space between survival and shame, anonymity and identity. Society rarely distinguished between guilt and inheritance. To outsiders, a name could define a person before they even spoke. And yet, the contrast is remarkable. William Patrick chose defiance, joining the U.S. Navy, fighting against his uncle's regime. Paula chose discretion, refusing media attention. Alois lived quietly, keeping a low profile. The courage in these choices is subtle but profound. It is the courage to define oneself, despite the weight of history pressing from every side. I cannot help but compare this to the families of other infamous figures. The children of Stalin, Mussolini, or Pol Pot also faced scrutiny, suspicion, and the challenge of separating themselves from bloodlines of terror. Yet each chose differently. Some embraced notoriety, some vanished entirely, and some, like William Patrick, built new lives in secret. Living with the name Hitler was not just about fear of association. It was about negotiating an identity that constantly collided with public memory. Every interaction became a test. Will they judge me by my deeds or by the sins of my family? And often, the answer was terrifyingly obvious. The notion of inherited guilt weighs heavily in these stories. Blood cannot be escaped, but character can be shaped by choices. I imagine the silent heirs in America, aware of history yet determined to live beyond it. Every step they take is deliberate, every move calculated to avoid the gaze of curiosity. The internal exile is profound. Even among friends and neighbors, the fear of accidental disclosure looms. It's a solitude born of necessity, not desire. But it is also a testament to resilience, the ability to reclaim a life from the shadow of a name. History's gaze is relentless. Yet these families demonstrate that it is possible to carry the past lightly if one is careful, discreet, and determined. I picture Alois walking through Hamburg, everyday routines tinged with the knowledge that any misstep could awaken whispers. I picture Paula tending her modest home in Berchtesgaden, silence as her shield. Even William Patrick's descendants in the U.S. navigate this legacy carefully. Their decision to remain childless, to avoid public exposure, is an act of control over history itself. What does it mean to live under a name that evokes horror? It is to live constantly aware, constantly negotiating between shame, memory, and self-determination. And yet, within that negotiation lies a strange dignity. The ability to choose restraint, to seek anonymity, and to reject the automatic association with evil. I find myself reflecting on the power of names, the burden of history, and the courage required to live quietly in the shadow of infamy. It is a reminder that history is not only shaped by the deeds of the powerful, but also by the lives of those who inherit their legacies. Imagine the quiet moments in these lives, a small dinner, a walk in the park, an evening at home. The world may never know, yet the weight of history lingers in every heartbeat. And perhaps this is the ultimate act of defiance. To survive, to live, and to quietly assert one's identity, even when the world expects shame. The memory of Hitler is monstrous, but the lives of his family teach us something unexpected. Even under the heaviest shadows, personal choice can carve a path toward dignity. Each glance from a neighbor, each whisper avoided, each decision to remain silent or move away is a testament. It is the testimony of ordinary people negotiating survival in the aftermath of extraordinary evil. The story of memory and shame is not just about guilt or fear. It is about reclaiming life, asserting identity, and finding a measure of peace under impossible circumstances. I keep imagining these descendants, their inner exile, their careful lives. It is a life defined by caution, but also by quiet courage. History casts long shadows, yet the human spirit can navigate them. The name may be notorious, but the choices remain individual, deliberate, and profoundly human. Even after decades, the question lingers. What does it truly mean to carry such a name? To exist quietly, away from fame, notoriety, and judgment, is perhaps an answer in itself. And so, the story of memory and shame continues. It is carried in streets, in homes, in quiet lives, and in the hearts of those who choose to live beyond the shadow. Now let me explain why the story of Hitler's family after 1945 is not just history, but a lesson in human choice, responsibility, and resilience. It is a story that teaches us how the weight of a name can shape lives and how courage can take quiet forms. William Patrick Hitler fled to the United States, fought in the Navy against his uncle, and rebuilt a life in obscurity. Paula Hitler chose modesty and seclusion in Berchtesgaden, refusing to exploit the family name despite persistent curiosity. Alois and Angela, living in post-war Germany, similarly vanished from public attention. Every member of the family made a conscious choice to remain invisible, to live with discretion, and to protect their lives from the glare of history. These choices carry an incredible educational lesson for us. They remind us that history is not only the story of famous leaders and infamous deeds, but also of those who navigate the aftermath. The lesson is clear. Personal choices matter more than inherited circumstances. But the real courage sometimes lies in restraint, in choosing a life of quiet dignity rather than exploitation. I find it deeply instructive to imagine the daily realities of these survivors. Every conversation, every interaction, every movement carried the risk of exposure, judgment, or suspicion. Their lives show us that courage is not always public or dramatic. It can be private, thoughtful, and deliberate, a constant negotiation with the past, the world, and oneself. Even William's descendants, choosing not to have children, embody this lesson of responsibility. They understood that legacy is not only about survival, but about the conscious decisions that define what the future will inherit. It is striking to compare this to other infamous families in history. Children and relatives of dictators often face the same scrutiny, yet the responses vary. This gives us a profound perspective on the intersection of history, morality, and personal agency. A name may carry infamy, but a life is defined by choices, ethics, and the courage to act differently. Their stories also reveal the complexity of human identity under extreme circumstances. They ask us to consider how much of ourselves is shaped by blood, by society, and by conscious decisions. Living under such a legacy required constant vigilance. The Hitlers after 1945 learned to measure every word, every action, every step they took. And there is an important educational takeaway here. We see that one's environment, heritage, or history does not determine destiny. Careful, principled decisions do. These quiet lives are lessons in ethics, discretion, and resilience. They show us how history's shadows can be navigated with dignity, and how silence itself can be a powerful act of resistance. Imagine William Patrick navigating American society, avoiding attention while honoring his own moral choices. Imagine Paula, alone in Berchtesgaden, guarding her privacy while rejecting the world's curiosity. Every decision they made, every step into obscurity, was a conscious effort to redefine what it meant to carry the Hitler name. And that is a lesson any of us can take to heart. Identity is not only inherited, it is chosen. Even the youngest generations, living quietly in the United States, illustrate this principle. They show that personal ethics, discretion, and careful living can transform a burden into a life of dignity. The story of Hitler's family after 1945 teaches us the power of restraint. It reminds us that silence, discretion, and thoughtful choices can be more impactful than fame, revenge, or notoriety. It asks us to reflect on our own lives. How do we confront the legacies we inherit? How do we take responsibility for what we can control? In this sense, their lives are not just historical curiosity. They are a guide, a mirror, and an ethical lesson. They show that even in the shadow of unimaginable evil, it is possible to live responsibly, carefully, and with integrity. History does not only belong to tyrants and monsters. It belongs equally to those who survive, who navigate shadows, and who choose dignity over spectacle. Hitler may have dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich, but his family chose silence and extinction. A final lesson for us all. Courage can be quiet, history can be resisted, and personal choices can redefine a legacy. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this video from? And which hidden or untold stories of history do you want us to explore next? Share your answers in the comments, and let's continue discovering the lessons that history often leaves unspoken.